Mike Benz, who is definitely worth a follow, recently did a video on this, so I'm just grabbing his coattails, but he has found a real smoking gun here. This is an essay written by George Soros in 1993, containing his view on the situation in post-Soviet Europe and the future of NATO, and also contains a brief outline of what Soros considers the definition of an open or closed society. For Soros, leaders are always working with an imperfect understanding of events. In an open society, this is recognized, whereas in a closed society, there is a dogma that is considered infallible. He then makes a conceptual jump that all nationalist governments are automatically closed societies, in order to justify his plans for the future of NATO. Now, this passage is particularly enlightening, so I'll read it out for you. The original mission was to defend the free world against the Soviet Empire. That mission is obsolete. But the collapse of the Soviet Empire has left a security vacuum which has the potential of turning into a black hole. This presents a different kind of threat than the Soviet Empire did. There is no direct threat from the region to the NATO countries. The danger is within the region, and it concerns conditions within the states as much as relationships between states. Therefore, if NATO has any mission at all, it is to project its power and influence into the region, and the mission is best defined in terms of open and closed societies. Closed societies based on nationalist principles constitute a threat to security because they need an enemy either outside or within. That isn't actually necessarily true. But the threat is very different in character from the one NATO was constructed to confront, and a very different approach is required to combat this threat. It involves the building of democratic states and open societies and embedding them in a structure which includes certain kinds of behavior. Only in case of failure does the prospect of military intervention arise. The constructive open society building part of the mission is all the more important because the prospect of NATO members intervening militarily in this troubled part of the world is very remote. Bosnia is ample proof. Now, obviously, NATO did, this was 93, NATO did intervene in Yugoslavia eventually with Milosevic, so just talking nonsense there, George. Unfortunately, the American proposal for the forthcoming NATO summit, the so-called Partnership for Peace, does not deal with this issue at all. It is a very narrow technical proposal for holding common exercises and otherwise preparing for possible future cooperation with member countries of the former Warsaw Pact. The scope of possible future cooperation is described as peacekeeping, crisis management, search and rescue missions, and disaster relief. While useful as far as it goes, it fails to address the conflicting security needs of the countries concerned. The countries of Central Europe are clamouring for full NATO membership, as soon as possible, preferably before Russia recovers. Russia objects not because it harbours any designs on its former empire, but because it seeks no advantage in consenting. Its national pride has been hurt, and it is sick and tired of making concessions without corresponding benefits. Wouldn't you be? The Partnership for Peace, far from being the product of profound new thinking, is rather a superficial attempt to paper over the differences by making an overture to all the former members of the Warsaw Pact indiscriminately, while leaving the prospect of some countries joining NATO deliberately vague. It may end up engendering more conflicts than it resolves. This is a great pity because the conflicts could easily be avoided if the real needs of the region were addressed. The primary need is for constructive engagement in the transition to democratic, market-oriented, open societies. This requires an association or alliance which goes far beyond military matters and contains a significant element of economic assistance. Both the military and economic aspects of the alliance have to relate to the internal political developments within states as much as do the relationships between states, because peace and security in the region depend first and foremost on a successful transition to open societies. The mission of this new kind of alliance is so radically different from the original mission of NATO that it cannot be entrusted to NATO itself. If it were, it would change NATO out of all recognition. A different kind of organisation is needed, and the proposed Partnership for Peace could be that organisation. Now, the Russians are often complaining about the eastward expansion of NATO, and it is clear from this passage that going into this 1993 NATO summit, that the West was going to have a much more arm's-length relationship with the former Soviet bloc states until Georgie Boy decided to stick his oar in and look at us now. It is also worth noting that Soros simply decides that his ideas should be funded from the NATO budget. So if you ever wondered how NATO can spend billions of dollars every year and then struggle to outcompete North Korea in the production of artillery shells, this is probably why. There is also a rather chilling sentence here. Incidentally, the combination of manpower from Eastern Europe with the technical capabilities of NATO would greatly enhance the military potential for the partnership, because it would reduce the risk of body bags for NATO countries, which is the main constraint on their willingness to act. It's basically exactly what happened in Ukraine. George Soros is the ultimate architect of the Ukraine war, because he thinks he gets to decide what kind of government the Russians have, even though it has absolutely nothing to do with him. And far from achieving peace, he has dragged us back to the brink of nuclear war, while wasting our taxes and in being involved in many other nefarious schemes that negatively impact the functioning of society. Even by Soros's own definition, the modern West, which he has done so much to ruin, has obvious dogmas that cannot be challenged, however far they may seem to stray from the truth, making us a closed society, just closed in the way that Soros wants. Now, there is not a lot more I can say about George or Alex Soros or the Open Society Foundation that is within the YouTube terms and conditions. So I'm going to end the video, but it is simply amazing how often you see something wrong with the world, investigate it, and it all leads back to George Soros.